can I do? 'Cause I'm just a sinking ship, and you're just a pair of lips that I've lost in the moment. All I want is for you to come back. Now I'm caught in the middle of life, and I
And welcome to another edition of the Red Pill Diaries. I'm your host, Rashid, and I'd like to thank each and every one of you for joining me on the most powerful platform for truth, bar none, on God's green earth. This is your platform for education, elevation, and edification. This is the Red Pill Diaries. And today we have a special guest amongst us, and he's coming out of Canada, and it's Professor Salim Mansur. Greetings, Professor.
Good evening, sir. It's
Yes,
a pleasure to be with you.
I don't know if you're doing this or if you want it, but your camera is not on. So if you don't want it on, it doesn't have to be on, but it's not on.
No, put it on, sir. It would be good.
Okay, it's on your end for the camera to come on.
Yeah. Oh, at my end, I have to do something?
Yes. Yeah. Because there it says cameras off. It's dark on yours. Let's see. Yes, on your end. But whether while you're doing that, we can still talk. I mean,
I put it on. I press command. Okay, so I press command. Is it on now?
Yes, you may have to hit the camera.
I hit the camera.
Let's do this. Let's go back out and come back in. You go out of the link, get off and come back in, and maybe your camera will readjust. Sometimes with StreamYard it does that, and so if you go back out and come back in the same link, okay, that'll work.
I will do that.
Okay, thank you so much. Everybody will wait for the professor to rejoin us on the platform, okay? Because he's having a little technical difficulties. But I'd like to thank each and every one of you for joining us, for giving us another hour of your day and another day of your time, because you did not have to spend it here. And we hope that you get an equal or greater payoff for the time that you spent with us today. So we're going to address a few issues. We're going to talk about a few things. And yes, there it is. There it is. We have the professor today. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing well. I'm not tech savvy, you know.
Neither am I. Neither am I. I often tell people, I say, listen, I wasn't brought up in the age of computers where these little kids can pick up something and they automatically know what it is. Exactly. I have to fumble my way through stuff to try to find out a lot. So
I rely on my daughter, young daughter.
Me too, Professor. Professor, I wanted to start off the show with, because the title of the show is Loss of Western Hegemony. And I wanted to get your perspective on Trump and the administration and how they are, it seems like, savagely attacking the pillars of international law to try to maintain their supremacy.
Well, it is ironic. What should I call you? Brother Rashid?
Yes.
Well, you are my brother. So,
yes, sir.
Brother Rashid, it is ironic because in 2015-16, I came around to support Trump during the primary against the 17 odd establishment people. And like many others, I thought that this outsider would be a positive change, that he would not be indebted to anybody, and that what he has been talking about at least had the attraction of those of us, me included, who recognized that America had gone off the rails, its Republican rails. That going off was not something recent from my perspective. It was, in fact, through the 20th century that had gone off. But if you just focus on the period after 1945, which in a sense becomes the American century. Now we are in the 80th year. It was in this period the exhilaration of going off the rails, its constitutional rail. America as the republic, born as the republic, have becoming an empire, despite the warnings, such as warning given by President Eisenhower in his farewell address that we're all familiar with, had gone off the rail, and that Trump might be able to, as he was talking about at that time, make America great again. Or some of us, me included, and I wrote about him and I spoke about him, that the primary basis of bringing back America onto its Republican rail would be to take to heart and put it into practice what was the farewell address of George Washington, not to get entangled with the world abroad and the quarrels of the world abroad and be fixated by alliance with any one single country or power at that time, late 18th century. And so it is turning the big ship away from these entanglements, going out looking for monsters to destroy, as President Quincy Adams, when he became the president, talked about. And that would be the beginning, in a sense, of retrenchment from the overextension of America had taken place to becoming an empire. Well, 10 years down the road, and all that we have gone through and witnessed, and the coming back of Trump in the second term, that it was a big con job, and we were all, in that sense, conned. I confess, I was conned, but I'm not an American. I know the role and the power and the position of America in the world affects everybody. One of our prime minister in Canada, when I arrived in Canada some 52 years ago, so I spent my entire life in North America, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau famously said that when America has a cold, Canada suffers from pneumonia. So, that's the relationship, in a sense, of America with the rest of the world. And we have been conned. America under President Trump is not only is a continuity of what began in small steps in the late 19th century with the Spanish-American War that brought eventually Cuba, Philippines, and others into the continental republic. But it expanded. There was just a brief period after World War I when people talk about American isolationism. But as you would know, brother, that was a period when the movement America First came into force. It slowly began against Woodrow Wilson taking America into World War I after having won the election in 1916 on the promise that he wouldn't take America into the war. And so there's this continuity going back to 1916 and the lies that were told, and then what happened, all the way into Donald Trump's presidency. The con game was that he spoke that he cannot do anything because his hands have been tied. These were the con attack, the impeachment, and so on and so forth, the special counsel. I mean, it was all a game. Now we can look back and future historian will have the documents to track it down if those documents become open. And then he comes back. He talks about in his inaugural address that he will be a peace president. And immediately after, within 2 weeks, he had Bibi Netanyahu in the White House. And America is fully committed under him, as it was under Biden, to expand the wars, not to be a peace president,
Mhm.
but it seems he is going to be the greatest warmongering president, and the world will be lucky, we will be lucky, fortunate, that the higher power that we believe in, the transcendent power, will intervene in his own ways to prevent a nuclear war and a nuclear fallout. So this is where we are, and to examine this, how and why it has come about, is again, there are many lines that converges right now in the second term of Donald Trump in office.
I often thought that people overlooked that Trump never denounced, even on the campaign trail, he never denounced American exceptionalism. He always embraced American exceptionalism, meaning that America must lead, and to me, that is just another form of saying that we're going to keep American imperialism. We're just going to do it under a new face. And that's what I kept telling people as they were saying, well, there'll be a change. And I keep telling them that America is not a republic anymore. America is not a democracy. It's an oligarchy. And this is why his administration, besides himself, has you can count 14 other billionaires, and we know that the billionaires would not make policy that are for the benefit of the masses. They will make policy that will make them rich and make them put them in a stronger position. And I want to play a short clip for you. And this is from Jeffrey Sachs. And I actually heard Vladimir Putin actually say this, and he was actually right. And Jeffrey Sachs is going to bring this up. And you give me your take on this right here.
There's a wonderful, wonderful. My wife doesn't like me to use that word when I refer to President Putin's statements. I will say just very accurate. And that is in an interview that President Putin gave to Le Figaro in 2017, he has an observation which I found very astute or very accurate. He said, I've dealt with 3 presidents now. He says they come to office with ideas, but then soon enough, the men in dark suits and blue ties show up and tell them the way the world really is. And that is why things continue as they are, essentially, no matter who is in office. And I think that there is a great deal of truth to that. When I look at foreign policy from Clinton, who was a Democrat, it's the economy, stupid. But he was the one that initiated the NATO enlargement. He was the one that bombed bombed Serbia in 1999 for 78 straight days. Then George W. Bush Jr., who had the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and who further enlarged NATO and then committed NATO to expand to include Ukraine and Georgia. Then Obama, the man of peace, the man who won the Nobel Peace Prize right at the start. And then he signs the order for the overthrow of the Syrian government. He invokes NATO to overthrow the Libyan government. He sends Victoria Nuland to overthrow the Ukrainian government. Well, come on. This is not proper behavior or in line with the public perceptions and precepts. Then Trump, he continues the arming of Ukraine. He, of course, doubles down on Israel in the Israel-Palestine disaster and tragedy, making things work. He rejects a peace agreement with Iran, which would have denuclearized Iran in return for dropping U.S. sanctions. So he leaves the world less safe. Then Biden, who's supposedly the opposite of Trump, comes in. And what does he do?
So that being said, it seems like all of these people are just two different sides to the same imperial coin. And we see that especially now as America moves to try to delegitimize the legitimate president of Venezuela. Because remember, when Maduro was elected, he was actually verified by the Carter Center. And the late Jimmy Carter said that it was actually one of the fairest elections and one of the greatest displays of democracy he had ever seen. And yet they're saying that he is not the legitimate president because he won't bow or kowtow to the United States. So with Trump's moves like this, isn't that showing that he is just a different side of the imperial coin? Oh, your mic is muted. All right, there we are.
I don't know. You would know, brother, that Britain, as an empire, possibly in the modern time, the largest empire, at least through the 19th century into the 20th, was known as perfidious Albion. An empire, by definition, then, is a perfidious Albion. Nothing that comes out of the mouth of the people in power in an empire has any resemblance to truth. There is no truth in an empire. And America today is the empire of lies, but it has been so. It has been so for a pretty long time. It is difficult to name a president in the last century who stood for the values of America as a republic. But I said, let's talk about post 1945. Well, there has been how many presidents? I mean, Roosevelt died. He was the 32nd president in 1945, just before the war ended. And so Truman was the 33rd president. And we are now in the 47th. So there has been, some presidents had double term. So there has been at least a dozen presidents since Roosevelt. And I think most people will agree that John F. Kennedy was the only president. And his killing, in my view, was the moment that America completely lost its soul. That soul went into the deepest circle of Dante's Inferno and has not been found. So the empire lies. Here you had President Trump greeting al-Shara, the present head-chopping dictator in Syria, who got the full blessing of the empire and its satellite, Israel, to come to Washington, enter the Oval Office. Well, this man was the deputy chief of Al-Qaeda under Zawahiri, who succeeded Osama bin Laden. He was an active leader of ISIS and al-Nusra in the Middle East. So how is it that this man then comes and sits in the Oval Office? Well, there has been, lines of people such as al-Shara who has come into the office. They are what Franklin Roosevelt at one time, talking about Central America and its presidents and leaders, called them, they are our sons of bitches. He was referring to Somoza's father. Somoza was the last president of Nicaragua when he was overthrown by the Sandinista revolution. And America was trying to stop that, remember the Contras. They call these head choppers freedom fighters, So there's nothing any more surprising. What will be surprising if the American people wake up and say they've had enough. They've had enough. They don't want to be, serfs and slaves in an empire of lies, and want the restoration of democracy, which would mean going back to taking up the lesson of our fallen heroes. I use myself as our, I am with you, brother. Our fallen heroes, Malcolm X, or Martin Luther King Jr., but certainly Malcolm X, Malik al-Shabazz, and what he said, what he spoke for, what he stood for. He stood for all of us, So unless that happens, America will continue to be the empire of lies and do everything that is unlawful, that is lawless, that is at the command of Lucifer. In God we trust is in your bill, but the God that America worship, that is the people in Washington worship, is Lucifer. And when somebody wrote about this, that when you rub the lamp of Lucifer, the CIA shines. That's the heart, the throbbing heart of the deep state. So Trump is completely part of the continuity. However, there is a big difference. Trump is at the tail end of the empire that can no longer flex his muscle
Yes.
as it did, when it strode forward to claim unipolar hegemony after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
And-
It had its run, and it has been exposed. Anyone around the world, especially the global South, who had, like I come from the global South, I was born in India. I think you are a Black American, Brother Rashid. So your people came, as they say, in the bottom layer of the ship from Africa, right? You didn't come out of choice, but many of us came out of choice. We came from escaping one empire into the jaws of another empire, not knowing that we were coming into another empire. And it happened precisely because of events instigated, ignited by the empires, whether it was people who fled Vietnam, people who fled Africa, people who fled from Afghanistan, people like myself who fled. I was a young man. I was just out of my teenage years, fled from the wars of South Asia, the genocide in South Asia in 1971, in what is now Bangladesh. And America had its hand filled with it, so this is continuing, but America was still, in more ways than one, a superpower economically, militarily, diplomatically, financially. But now, America, that the throne, so to speak, of the empire of lies that Trump is sitting on, has gone immensely weak, relatively speaking. We all know about the financial situation. $38 trillion in debt, and then on the issues of entitlements, it is furthermore trillions of dollars that America owe in the future to its own people, and whether it will be able to live up to those commitments like Social Security. Militarily, we have seen the result now in the Ukraine war. What was planned, what was expected, that the very threat of NATO would begin the second collapse of the Russian Federation. But almost 4 years later, it is NATO that is on the brink of breaking apart and collapsing, and Trump is desperately trying to find a way out of the quagmire that he himself started in his first term. And the world is witnessing it. The world has witnessed it, that, what Mao Zedong at one time used to call paper tiger, America is becoming a paper tiger. in the sense that with peer powers, Russia, China, and the new world that is emerging is on the cusp of taking shape and coming into the forefront. I'm referring to the BRICS nation and the partnership of Russia and China that has come together as a result of the Ukraine war, and their provision of leadership. They're providing the leadership, and BRICS has all the potential to become a main deciding actor for almost 70%, 75% of the world population, and majority of the countries of the global south, Latin America, Africa, Asia. So the hegemonic rule of the Eurocentric powers is over. That's my major point, in talking to my student, describing the situation, that it was looking back. We always look back at history. It is a retrospective analysis. We are not, and we make the calculation or inferences not because we have a crystal ball, but looking for patterns in history. So looking back in retrospect, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, in a sense, was foretold. It was an artificial, tyrannical, unlawful in many ways, and of course, the foundational basis of what became the Soviet Union was Bolshevism, another Luciferian ideology coming out of the Jewish population. The Bolsheviks were 80% or more at the time of the revolution were Russian Jews or East European Jews. So the collapse in 1991, looking back retrospectively, was almost providential. It was the eve of the 500th anniversary of Christopher Columbus sailing across in what is traditionally said was a discovery. Well, it is the discovery of the European. There were people in the New World that we call, or the Americas. So that was 1492. And 1992 was the 500th anniversary of Columbus arriving, that began the rape, the pillage, the plunder of the Americas by the Europeans, that was extended all across all the four continents. That year marked in many ways the end of the Eurocentric world. For 500 years, the Eurocentric world had dominated all other cultures and civilization in plundering and extortion, which was the main goal. And they continued that. And is continuing that as you talk about Venezuela. That's another matter of extortion, So here we are. The Eurocentric age was over because the world had progressed in a manner in which they did not know or could have anticipated that the European wars would be the death knell of the European empires. It is very interesting to take note that as soon as the war in Europe ended in May 9th of 1945, 2 weeks after that, the election was called in Britain. And Churchill, the great imperialist, was taken down by the British people. And the first announcement by the incoming Prime Minister Clement Attlee, was the announcement that Britain will be withdrawing from India, and India will have its independence. When Roosevelt asked Churchill during the war, when will India be given independence? He said, I will not be the last prime minister of the emperor. to fold up his empire, you know. So just 2 weeks after the end of the war, that India, the crown jewel of the empire, was announced would be given its independence, you know. And that was the beginning of the withdrawal, the rapid withdrawal that took place. Within 10 years, the British Empire was left with, you know, the Commonwealth countries that still preferred to be part of the British Crown, like Canada is, like Australia is, like New Zealand is. But the rest of the British Empire, you know, took its independence and left the empire in that sense. But it's still there was neo-colonialism, but because these newly independent countries, including India, was still attached to the empires, you know, the umbilical cord was still there. It had not been snapped completely. The extortion continued uh, until uh, a generation and two later, the process of detachment began. So by the 1960s, India was one of the major countries of the global south that led the non aligned movement. And I would say to those people who are aware of that historical record, the non alignment movement eventually became the biggest bloc of countries in the United Nations, something like 77 countries of Africa, Latin America, and Asia coming together that said, we don't want to be part of the American imperium, nor do we want to be part of the Soviet bloc. You know, we are non aligned. We will engage and trade as independent countries, you know, sovereign countries with whomever we want to do. And so I would suggest that the not non aligned movement that fell dormant during this period after 1992, the changes that came about in global politics with United States declaring itself to be the unipolar hegemony, the entire writing of those policies, which as we now know, the Project for New American Century, you know, the PNAC
Mhm.
policy, the neocons and all of that. We can get into it. But the point is, non-alignment movement went dormant, but it has been now revived, reborn in a new shape, but they're the same countries. India is a founding partner. Brazil is a founding partner. South Africa is a founding partner. China and Russia, of course, are the two leading partners. Is the BRICS nation, and it is expanding. You know,
Mhm.
so this was going to happen. You cannot be a unipolar power, that there will be one single power trying to rule the rest of the world.
Mhm.
And this idea that the America, led by neocons or their policies and the Zionists, is going to make a bid to be the world power, the globalist ideology, imposing its values upon the rest of the world, was a pipe dream. The question is, what will be the cost
Mhm.
of the eventual transition from this fading idea of unipolarity and unipolar hegemony to the more mature, responsible, human acceptance of the reality that the world is multipolar. There are other civilizations, there are other voices, and of course, there are competing interests that has to be negotiated, not bombed into non-existence, which is what Trump is doing. But this is the action of a dying empire. It is not
Mhm.
the action of an empire that is robust and stands as a model, as an ideal for the rest of the world, or for the majority of the world to acknowledge and to accept. America has nothing in that sense to offer. America had everything to offer what the founding fathers had established. It was an incredible. I mean, I speak here as a historian, as a political economist, and looking back as a political philosopher, that the 1776 revolution was an absolutely new sense of a beginning based upon the values of the age of enlightenment, whose exemplification was found in the Declaration of Independence authored by Thomas Jefferson and in the Constitution that was eventually ratified in 1789. These two documents, with the Federalist letters read alongside them for historical context, are an absolutely, the ideal exemplification in the political sense of the values of the age of enlightenment. But all of that started falling apart within decades, the end of the Civil War and the emancipation of the slaves, of the black people of America that had been brought in and driven down in manner that brother. We can only read about it, but you and your ancestors have experienced it to subhuman life, and there has been in that sense no accounting for it yet,
Mhm.
But the same thing is around the world. I mean, as we watch what is happening in Palestine, what happened in South Africa, what happened in Vietnam. The story of India itself is extremely complicated. The story of China, how it was opened up to opium trade and extortion, and who were these people who did that?
Mhm.
So that is. It is not that the other cultures and other civilizations were in any way exemplification of the highest morals in the world. No, it wasn't. But it was living in a different time with a different set of understanding of economy, of how to survive and make existence and build. And so those are complex topics to get into. But as the world entered into the new age of science and technology in the 18th century onwards, America stood at the forefront, you know, ahead of everything, representing those ideas of science and technology. But others have now caught up. Chinese have caught up, Indians have caught up, other cultures and civilizations are not too far behind. The Iranians have caught up. And they are old civilization too. They have their pride, they have their memory, they have their pain, they have their successes. And a point has come that abusing others cannot be the path of greatness for oneself. And the question is, when will people in Washington understand this?
Yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking about how I try to enlighten my audience about hidden history, especially concerning America. Like when they talk about the first slaves were brought here in 1619. In actuality, when you do the research, the first slaves were brought here in 1555 on April 1st, which is April Fool's Day, by a slave trader by the name of John Hopkins or John Hawkins. Hawkins. They have universities named after him. And the reason they tell you that it was in 1619 is because the 64 years leading up to 1619 was so horrific that they try to write it out of history about how they brought the people off the ships. They split the mothers' bellies open, let the children drop in front of everybody, smashed the babies, and they raped the strongest men so that the psychological effect on these people so that they can breed them as animals. And it was 64 years of this that took place that they wrote out because it was so inhumane and so disgusting that they did not want the American people to understand that they named it the 64 years it took to make a nigger. From a great people, a nigger, and that's where you get that from. And a lot of people don't understand that environment shapes a person just as much as DNA does. And and I said that to say this: don't you think that with all of the injustice that America and the Western world has dished out to the whole world, as they see the same nations like China and the BRICS nations rising up, Africa rising up, Latin America rising up, and they no longer hold their stranglehold of economics, empire, and is this the reason why they're lashing out? Because the playing field is becoming even, and with these great populations, means that now they have scientists, lawyers, doctors that can compete on the same field without American and Western advantage. And because of that, I believe that the Western leaders are losing it, and they would rather destroy the world or cause chaos than to leave the world for a multipolar world. Because as you said before, you said we look through history for patterns. And if you look at the Cold War, for instance, the United States had a policy that if a nuclear war took place between the Soviet Union and the United States, even if China or India or Pakistan wasn't involved, that when they launched the missiles on the Soviet Union, they would launch them on them too, as to not leave them in a position of power. So we're looking at a collapse of an American empire, a Western world. Is that not what we're seeing in real time with the lashing out at Venezuela, Iran, and the rest of the world?
Yes, absolutely. That's what I said, a little while ago, that these actions are the last desperate acts, irrational acts of an empire that doesn't know how to resolve all the various contradictions that is both ravaging its own domestic society as well as the ravages of what the empire has done abroad is coming back. Look, brother, I mean, the Ukraine war is just the flip side of the Cuban crisis.
Mm-hmm.
What is it that the Americans didn't understand about that? That the 535 people that you Americans sent to the Congress to represent you, what is it that they did not understand? That when the Soviets, without getting into the details, agreed to defend Cuba from the Americans by sending in their missiles that could be armed with nuclear weapons, the crisis happened. And it was a very simple argument. You cannot come to the backyard of America. Forget about Monroe Doctrine and all of that. Simply the geopolitics, the military side of it, that you cannot come to the backyard of America 90 miles from the Florida coast and position your nuclear weapons there. So what is good for the goose is good for the gander. What was missing in the understanding of the American establishment in Washington, the representatives of the people in the Senate and the House, that as you played Professor Jeffrey Sachs' clip, and we have all been talking about this. I wrote about this immediately as the crisis came about, I think in the second week of February 2022, in my Substacks, published in my Substack, detail and did several podcasts with on the subject. What is it's so difficult to understand that irrespective of who is in office in the Kremlin, none of them would agree to see Ukraine brought into NATO and NATO weapon system being positioned in Ukraine. It is simple as that. And yet here it is 4 years later, with over 1 million Ukrainian dead, billions of dollars spent in arms, ammunition, and in lining the pockets of the politicians on both sides, Ukraine and in America, the laundering process of all that is illicit. The result is what would have happened in Cuba if the Soviet Union did not withdraw its missiles, if they tried to break the moratorium or that President Kennedy had placed around Cuba for the ships to travel through, and so they turned around, and so diplomacy prevailed, and everything followed from there. And hopefully, looking back, a lesson was learned, but now we know the lesson was not learned. The empire doesn't learn any lesson because the empire believes that it has the resources and the power to impose its will on anyone who stand in its way. The other thing about empires is, Brother Rashid, which is not paradoxical. It is, I think, it comes with the characteristic of an empire. The empire believes that the people who run the empire believe they don't need to know anything about you or about me. That is about the Russians, about the Chinese, about the Indians, about the Iranians, their history, their culture, their memory, their value. They don't need to know, because the only people that count, as you correctly pointed out, is we, the exceptional people, or as the Zionists say, the chosen people. As if God has chosen people. This and the utter absurdity of this idea uh, doesn't make them have any response that this is an absurdity that we are holding on to. But that absurdity eventually hits back. And it hits back when, to the natural process of what happens in the life of anyone, including the life of an empire, as Shakespeare said, the 7 stages of man. As you reach the 7th stage, you're no longer capable of doing what you were able to do when you were in the 3rd stage. And this is what the Americans are facing. But the characteristic of an empire is that level of arrogance, hubris, and ultimately immaturity. That they discount all of these things because they think they're the exception.
Yeah, and I was thinking that, and I often bring this up on the platform, that there are laws which govern the universe, and there are scientific laws which govern the universe, and the Western world thinks that it can mute those laws when it says that any action that is given must receive an equal or greater reaction, and they have given out hell to the world, and I'm saying that at one point it has to come back on you in such a manner that will break you down. And why do you think that in their mind they think that they can mute God's laws, or that they can mute the laws of science and nature, and they don't have to feel the brunt of what they put on the back of everybody else?
Yes, absolutely. It is the inner desire or wishes of a godless people to become God. It is not the believer. It is not people who believe in a higher power, who have the hubris, the arrogance to say, well, I can also be the higher power. you know. So it is the godless people. You can see that it is the godless people. America has become a godless society. Europe has become a godless society. And so in a godless society, I mean, it used to be said about the British Parliament that the British Parliament has the power to do anything it wishes to do, except make a man a woman or woman a man. You know, in other words, to interfere, as you said, with the laws of nature. Uh, but now, with technology that they believe they have in hand, that they say that this technology has no limitation. You have that guy in Israel, Yuval Harari, who is dedicated in talking about how artificial intelligence will completely replace man. Possibly, in his mind, it will. In other words, there's no limitation. They can do whatever they want. So this whole woke culture that we saw come alive in America and in the Western societies, that man can be a woman, and a woman can be a man, and everything of that nature, that you can interfere with the natural process in a manner to basically upturn the natural process, upturn nature's law. Uh, is an ongoing effort to play God, but there is not only natural limitation in how you can play God, it is also the fact that there are other cultures that might have some capacity to go in that direction but will not, because they have the guardrails of their tradition, of their faith, of their culture, that you don't exceed the guardrails. I mean, in the question of Iran, for instance, the JCPO, which Donald Trump tore up. It was an agreement signed by the 5 permanent members of the United Nations, including Germany and Iran, under the agreements, conventions, and treaty within the United Nations, the IAEA, the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and so on. It was signed, and the Iranians wanted it because subsequently, after Donald Trump tore up the JCPOA, Iran was therefore no longer obliged to follow the agreement and could pursue on its own openly uh, its desire. If it had that desire, it had the resources, it had the knowledge, it had the technology, it had the people who could do it to become a nuclear power. But the Ayatollah, the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Khamenei, gave the religious opinion, the fatwa, that no, we're not going to have nuclear weapons. This is against our humanity and against the humanity and what is needed for the world. Knowing fully well that Israel was a nuclear power country, though it doesn't disclose it, and that Israel had been calling for the destruction of Iran for the past 35 years. But the ruling was, and it was a religious ruling. It was not a scientific ruling. It was not a secular ruling. It was a ruling not voted upon. It was the authority of the religious leader to say no. That doesn't exist in a godless society, right? That is exactly an indication of where United States has gone and become, as opposed to the founding fathers. And it is, of course, the situation in Europe. I travel to Europe quite frequently. I was recently in Europe this year, as I go quite often. And one of my thing that I do is I visit the old cathedrals. I like to do that, whether I'm in Paris, whether I'm in Prague, or wherever I go. I enjoy with my wife, with my daughter. And you know what? You go into these old, wonderful Gothic cathedrals, and instead of sitting and attending a service, we listen to orchestral music because that's what it has become. Those massive cathedrals have become theaters. It is such a sad reflection of what happens to a society when it willfully abandons its inheritance, its tradition.
Mhm.
And that's what we are witnessing. We don't talk about it, or the American people don't talk about it enough. That in the period since 1974, Roe versus Wade, over 60 million babies, and most of them, or a large proportion of them, being children of blacks, have been aborted. This is the numbers are 10 times more than what we are told was the death toll of Jews in the Holocaust. So in America, we have had 10 Holocausts. And same thing in Canada, same thing in Europe, and people are still going along with it.
Mhm.
And nature, when nature is abused in this fashion, there is profound repercussion that you cannot anticipate what will be the repercussion.
Mhm.
And so that loss of 60 million babies is the loss of 60 million people who would be in their adulthood now, who would be a fact of life in America, in making in America a much more buoyant society.
Mhm.
But that is not the case. And the cumulative effect of such things is devastating in the long term. But nobody talks about this because the focus is only on the 2-year cycle of election and
Mhm.
how we can deceive the people.
Mhm. That's right. And a lot of people don't know that this was government policy to do that, to set up the abortion clinics in the inner city. And Margaret Sanger, the leader of Planned Parenthood, who was a eugenist and a supremacist, said that not a word of this should come out about what we're trying to do and exterminate them. And then we hear in the presidency where um, President Nixon formulates a policy to flood the black community with drugs, and then to put crime, to enhance crime, and to put it on the news nightly. But if there's a crime committed by a black person, it would be put up there and enhanced. But if it was not by a black person, it would be downplayed. And they don't understand how this plays into the psyche of the masses of the people. And when you do that, you're undermining the very base of cohesiveness and the very base of society. And I was talking about on one of my shows, I think the last show, I was telling people, I went into the Bible for them, some of the people who are Christians or whatever, and I reminded them that Satan said that he wanted to build a kingdom like unto the Most High. And in their book, the Bible says that when God he created man in his image and his likeness, and he breathed into him his inspiration. Well, when we look at the policies of the American empire, the British Empire, the Western world, that is what they're trying to do to the rest of the world. They're trying to breathe into them into what they think is best for them, into their likeness. In other words, in their mind, they are the gods and they are the exception to the rules, and everybody else is beneath them. And this is what's causing the unraveling of the financial system, the unraveling of the social society. This is the military, everything. But nobody takes heed to this. And one of the greatest hindrance, and I think one of the greatest detriments to the American and Western society, is the destruction of their educational system. Because as you brought up, those people that were aborted, those could have been future doctors, lawyers, astronauts, scientists, and stuff. But no one takes heed to this, that the defunding and the undercutting of the educational system is actually the nuclear bomb laid at the base of the republic, the empire, and the Western world.
Well, absolutely right, brother. I mean, the destruction of the family, uh, the traditional family, was one of Marxist ideas that was pushed right at the outset, destroy the family, because the family is the basis of a civilized society. So if you destroy the family, as you said, that's the nuclear bomb. The effect of that ripples through the rest of the society. It destroyed the sense of responsibility, of accountability, of what we owe to the society, what the society owe to us, in a manner in which the family is protected and the family grows, and the family is the foundation of, again, civilization. But the destruction of the family was the major aim of Marxism. You know, it is very interesting to note, since you have brought this up, um, the the year that Hitler became the chancellor of Germany was the same year as Franklin Roosevelt was inaugurated in his office. March 1933, January 1933 was Hitler coming to the office. One of the first uh, policy decision that came out, which ultimately led to the writing of the act that Hitler wanted, was race laws that ultimately became Hitler's Nuremberg laws. Uh, and where did Hitler turn to adopt the race laws? Turn to America. The German jurists and law professors and others immediately took up looking into the race laws in the southern states, segregation, KKK, and in how many different ways the Americans decided whether you were a black man or you were a white man, whether you were 1/4 black and 3/4 white, or whether you were 1/5 white and 4/5 black, and so on and so forth. The entire structure of the Jim Crow laws, the KKK, and segregation, school segregation, and segregation right across the society, were studied to put into effect in Germany. Instead of blacks in America, in Germany, it would be the Untermenschen, among them, the principal one being the Jews, the gypsies, and so on and so forth. So America was a model for the fascist power, which nobody wants to talk about today. Same thing with eugenics. It was, of course, Margaret Sanger, an American woman, who began this whole process. It was the powerful houses, the Rockefellers and others, who financed them for getting eugenic policy into the mainstream. So Planned Parenthood comes from that background into the mainstream. So when our prime minister recently, he's no longer the prime minister, he was the prime minister until this year, went out to Africa a few years ago, visiting Uganda, Ghana, Ivory Coast, with aid mission, to give Canadian aid and assistance. The conditionality was that this society have to become more open, more flexible, more accommodating to homosexual, lesbian, transgender values, and to be more open to abortion, family planning. And the president of Uganda, the president of Ghana, they basically showed the door to the prime minister. Prime minister just said, you know. So this has been the problem. They want to convert the entire global south to their values, and it is not going to happen. People are not going to accept this, but they want the pride flag to fly, the rainbow pride flag to fly. When the pride movement came into practice here up north in Canada, one of the things that really puzzled me was the term pride, which is condemned in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
The seven sins, and among the seven sins, pride is one of the major sins.
Mm-hmm.
And yet this was being sold as pride, and that is, in a sense, one of the key symbol or indicators of how Christian society, a majority Christian people, have been turned into becoming the godless people.
Mm-hmm.
The effects of that,
Mm-hmm.
nobody had to say it. You just push this agenda, and the society becomes godless. There are no more guardrails, because when the life of an infant in the most secure place in the world, that is the mother's womb, can be taken away, torn out and taken away, then life is no more sacred. That's
Mm-hmm.
what we are seeing in the genocide in Gaza. And the surprising thing, we haven't spoken about the Middle East, about Palestine. Maybe it is a subject that deserves its own focus and time and energy. But since I mentioned it, the most surprising thing is, and actually one shouldn't be surprised once we grasp the notion of godlessness, that the collective West, that is Western Europe or Europe in total, and North America, United States and Canada, have totally abandoned the United Nations Charter and all the conventions and treaties which they themselves wrote.
Yep. Yep.
The Convention on Genocide was written after the end of Second World War on the basis of Holocaust. Nobody talks about nearly 30 million Russians being killed, which is 5 times the Holocaust. Sometime I would have to remind my students about that. But for the 6 million casualties or deaths that the Jews say happened in the Holocaust, the convention was written. The convention, and Israel was one of the first country to sign the convention, beside America, beside Canada, beside Britain, France, Germany, so on and so forth, and the rest of the world. And when the genocide happens, there is a full-fledged denial by the very countries who created and signed the convention.
Mm-hmm.
So hypocrisy is the word written in large letters across the collective West. It is the letters that defines what is godlessness. I mean, it was Jesus who defined it by saying to those Jews, the Pharisees, that your father was a liar and you are a liar. Jesus
Mm-hmm.
is, after all, our prophet, in the prophet of Islam,
That's right.
my most revered prophet,
Mm-hmm.
right?
That's right.
And so what Jesus says is words for me, sacred words for me.
Mm-hmm.
And the entire West has gone silent on the mother of all crimes, that is genocide.
But if whenever they want to push the narrative of the other side, you must honor the so-called genocide that happened to the Jews in Germany. They never talk about the genocide of King Leopold when he just got mad one day and just slaughtered 10 million Africans. Or and just throw it away. But the most horrendous person in the West is Hitler, and even Nixon did not agree that 6 million Jews were killed. There are some recordings of him talking that maybe upwards of 100,000 were killed or something like that, and by mostly Jewish people, but that gets left out. The narrative, because it doesn't fit the narrative of the West to break the mental the thinking capacity of the West, because and I often say this, this comes as a double-edged sword. To dumb down the people so that you can keep power also destroys the society, because these are the future lawyers, doctors, scientists, and engineers of the future. And at the moment, because you want to present a narrative and you want to keep power, you're dumbing down the very base of your society, which it'll catch up with you on the international stage, as we see India and Africa and China out competing the West now. And now the West is now relegated to threats, sanctions, and war.
Oh, absolutely. You triggered my memory. I'm trying to remember the name. Andrew, the first Black American that was appointed as American ambassador to the United Nations by Jimmy Carter. You remember him? Andrew Young.
Mm-hmm.
Andrew Young was the first Black American ambassador to the United Nations. And then he had to be removed. He had to step down because a hue and cry was raised in America that Andrew Young had spoken with the Palestinian representatives in the United Nations. Well, what is there for an ambassador to do if he doesn't speak with the representative of other people at the United Nations? But it was a hue and cry that led to Andrew Young's departure from the United Nations. But you are absolutely right. This is exactly what has happened. The dumbing down of education is itself a whole planned operation, just as was COVID-19,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have seen in our lifetime not only the impoverishment of people in the most advanced and rich countries of the West, but we have also seen the governments of those countries attack the people, especially the people who are the most vulnerable in society, to eliminate them. COVID-19 was another depopulation strike. Dumbing down of the education is another depopulation strike. The nature of the adulterated food that we have become, fed with, is the process of all sorts of diseases that has spread in the population. Obesity leading to diabetes, heart attacks, coronary problems. But all these come from this contaminated food. So we have become a civilization that Thomas Eliot, the great American poet, who left America for Europe at the turn of the last century, 20th century, wrote in his most famous poem that was published just a little over 100 years ago, called The Wasteland. The wasteland is the metaphor for a devastated and empty society and culture. And he was writing after the World War I, when Europe, in front of his eyes, destroyed millions of its own people. It was a European war. And people can wonder, what was it for? But the effect of that war that T.S. Eliot wrote about did not go away. It has only gone deeper. It has only spread wider. It has only brought upon more and more casualties in different ways. We are living in a wasteland. Godless society is a wasteland. It's a moral wasteland. And a society that is morally depraved has no virtue in it. no value in it. The founding fathers were very, uh, insofar as my reading goes, I mean, after all, the revolution and the Constitution was brought about in a country that was less than 100 years later defined by Abraham Lincoln, you know, where the inequality, the slavery, in the famous Gettysburg Address I'm thinking about, he talks about this, So the society was still half free and half slave. The republic was not complete. There had to be another revolution, and that revolution was the Civil War. That Lincoln talks about. 70 years ago, our fathers brought forth to this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the promise, etc., etc. The point being that promise has not been fulfilled, and it had to be fought over in a manner that was, apart from everything, tragic, and its effect has continued. It took another 100 years after the end of the Civil War for the passages of human rights, civil rights, ending of segregation. But what is become inbred in man, you might legally remove it, but man has to grow, mature, understand that legal removal of a thing doesn't reshape the man. The man has to reshape himself back to moral values. And that was between the end of Civil War, 1865, and the beginning of the civil rights movement in 1963, 64, exactly 100 years. And we are now, 60, 70 years removed from that, and yet the problem persists. As you are saying, as you're pointing out, in the dumbing down of education, in the inequalities of housing, in the inequalities that exist in terms of employment, healthcare, and so on and so forth. In the richest, at least it claims to be the richest land in the world. And where is the money going? Where is the hard-earned money of the people, the tax to their, head going? It's going into wars. And what has been the results of this war? Where has there been any effective result? They were going to bring democracy in Afghanistan. Can democracy be planted like a rose bud somewhere? It has to go from the soil itself. They committed a genocide in Vietnam, but nobody has been held accountable. They used chemical weapons in Vietnam. Apart from losing 58,000 Americans in a war that had no purpose but keep the military-industrial complex going, and the people invested in the military-industrial complex earning illicit amounts of money.
Yeah.
And the same thing is happening with Venezuela right now, or with Colombia, or with this whole notion of drug. Well, the problem is in America. Control the border and stop the drugs coming in. If there is a market for drugs, the drugs are going to flow in. So we shuffle off the problem without taking responsibility that we are the ones who are the source of the problem. Our addiction, our education system that has broken down, our families that are broken down, and our health system that is broken down. And then the money goes into the pocket of that 1%, as you began, the oligarchs.
Yeah, I just think that they don't understand, and I don't think the scientists understand just how the wise of the wise should take note to the dumbing down and the destruction of the America's educational system, because in reality, as I often tell people, it is education which civilizes us. And when you dumb down that and you defund that, you are actually becoming an incubator of savagery. And we see that domestically, and we see America's foreign policy mimics the savagery that she shows domestically. And now the whole world is getting a look at the collapse of the American empire. Just if you say, you ask a simple question to everybody: who's America's first president? The first person they would say was George Washington, but there were 8 presidents prior to George Washington. But nobody ever said, this is what I'm saying. The narrative, if it does not live up to Walt Disney World or the deceit that the government wants, then they discard it or they push it behind closed doors, and this has become an even greater detriment to upholding the fabric of society, because lies cannot maintain what the Holy Quran and the Bible tells you, that God created the heavens and the earth in truth. And if they're created in truth, and what you're promoting is falsehood, then science teaches us that that any unnatural object that comes in contact with a natural object, the natural object must destroy the unnatural object, or both are destroyed. And we're looking at the unnatural educational system, the unnatural exceptionalism, capitalism, racism, fascism being destroyed, and the upliftment of the rise of the global South, which is more natural, a more equitable world. What do you say about that?
No, I agree with you, brother. And as I was saying, we have turned, we meaning the rulers of the society. The effect of that is, of course, on that population that was the target, in the sense, to effectively destroy them, but destroy them in a manner in which they themselves will participate in the self-destruction. Amuse them, give them toys to play with, give them, food to which they get addicted that doesn't bring about natural growth and health, and so on and so forth. I mean, this is what, but it all begins with destruction of the family. Education can only be successful if the family unit is strong and committed. A church or a mosque is as strong and as successful and thriving as is the family, because the family is the first school before the child goes to the next level of school. But if the first school has, in a sense, warped his thinking, destroyed his sense of pride and responsibility, then what he's carrying with him forward will be the result of what happened in the family. It was the Jesuit priest who would say that give me a child, 5 years and under, and I will shape him for the rest of his life. So that's the same thing in the Quranic schools, in the madrasas. It begins with the family. The famous, one of the very important hadith of the Prophet, saying of the Prophet, is that your religion, Islam, your faith, your tradition, half of it is you getting married, because it is through marriage that the fulfillment of what we call the Sharia now, the rules, the way of the Quran, because the original meaning of Sharia is the path, the straight path, Sirat al-Mustaqim, the right path. You cannot have a journey on the right path unless you have a family, because half or more than half is the responsibility that a man owes to his family, a woman owes to her family. It is a collaborative and a joint effort. And so unless that is secure, the foundation is secure, you can't have a roof.
Mhm.
Everything in addition is the building of the roof, but there has to be the foundation. So that foundation has been, targeted, was targeted, and has been destroyed. You see, we have become a nuclear family, and from a nuclear family, we have become, I'm talking about in the general sense, in the generic sense, from a nuclear family, we have become a mixed family. The child doesn't know who his parents are, because it's a mixed family. Broken family with marriages taking place or partnerships taking place, with children from the previous partnership walking into the home, and those departing from the home. So it is a state at the most vulnerable and impressionable age of a child, that is around 3 years old, that he and she are being bombarded with events and activities that he cannot make sense of. A child is naturally, from the moment of his coming into the world, birth, and before that, the conception, knows his mother, and the mother then tells, this is your father. And that is the natural bonding. You can see that in the animal world as part of the human creation, God's creation. That natural instinct is the foundation that has to be cultivated, cultured, and nourished. But if you destroy that, then it is over. And what you are saying, brother, is simply the corollary of what was the axiom. You see, the axiom has been destroyed.
All I can say is shukram. Thank you for joining me on this platform. We have to have you back on, Professor. We have to have you back on the platform. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you very much. And it is a pleasure. I'd heard about you. I saw you flashing Larry Johnson. I listened to Judge Napolitano, as many times as I can. And so I am familiar with Larry Johnson, and Larry Johnson has spoken very highly of you. He tells his audience that he has been on the podcast with Rashid Muhammad, and I haven't seen those podcasts, can't keep up with all the podcasts that is around, but I was familiar with your name, and when I received your invitation, it was a real joy. I thought that the hands of providence are bringing us together.
Alhamdulillah.
So, alhamdulillah. Yes, brother.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, and be blessed and be safe. Thank you.
Yes, same to you.
Everybody, listen, as I often say before we go off the show, do right by others, not because there's some material gain or some accolades or some applause to be had. Do right by others because it's the right, the humane, and the godly thing to do. Because even when no one else is watching you, remember that God Almighty is watching you. As my late, great, and awesome mother would always say, God sits high on the throne of power, but he looks lowly at the actions of man. Know that I love each and every one of you who loves truth, but know that the love that I have for you will always pale in comparison to the love that the true and living God has for you. Until we next speak again, stay strong, stay true, but above all things, remember to stay righteous, because righteousness is the only thing that will get you out of here. Hey, mama, your baby boy loves you more than life. Deuces, everybody. Thank you all for joining me. We're out of here. Peace.
Shukran.
Shukran.
Told you to walk away. That was my first and last mistake. I'm blue without your face. But what can I do? 'Cause I'm just a sinking ship, and you're just a